Let's move to preserving your immune system. A decline in immune function is one of the most well-recognized consequences of aging. We see this in increased vulnerability to acute viral and bacterial infections such as the flu and pneumococcal pneumonia. In the developed world, infectious diseases are the fourth leading cause of death among the elderly, who suffer triple the mortality rate of acute infections compared to younger adults. This is exacerbated by a relatively poor response to vaccination, a phenomenon that's been recognized since the dawn of vaccine development. For example, while flu shots can build up sufficient antibody protection in 50 to 75% of younger individuals, that proportion falls to as few as 10 to 30% of older adults, who are among those who need the protection the most. At the same time, we've known for nearly 30 years that the immune cells of 80-year-olds produce significantly more pro-inflammatory signals. As I discussed in the inflammation chapter, this suggests the worst of both worlds, a decline in the part of the immune system that fights specific infections, and an aggravation of nonspecific overreactions that can lead to inflammation. We saw this play out with COVID-19. Certainly, older adults are more likely to be in tinderboxes like nursing homes and carry comorbidities that make infection more likely and serious, but part of their vulnerability may lie in both declining immune function and the potential for a hyperinflammatory, so-called cytokine storm immune reaction linked to poorer outcomes. Since I already covered the inflammaging dimension, I'll concentrate here on immunosenescence, the decline in immune defense with aging, and what we can do about it. For the too fantastical to be believed overview on how the immune system actually works, see my infections chapter in How Not to Die. Let's start with lifestyle. How can our daily habits influence our immune function? Weight loss. Obesity can weigh down the efficacy of vaccination, such that despite flu shots, individuals who are obese have double the risk of coming down with the flu or flu-like infections compared to healthy weight-vaccinated individuals. In fact, one of the reasons obese persons have higher cancer rates may be an impairment in anti-tumor immunity. The Swedish Obese Subjects Trial, or SOS trial, was the first long-term controlled study to assess the outcomes of thousands of bariatric surgery patients against matched control subjects who began the trial the same weight but then followed a non-surgical route. Over the next 10 to 20 years, the control group's weights remained about the same, while the surgical group maintained about a 20% weight loss and also suffered significantly fewer heart attacks and strokes, developed 80% less diabetes, and, not surprisingly, had lower overall mortality. They also got less cancer. Obesity severely impairs the function of our natural killer cells, critical members of our immune system's rapid response force, fighting against cancerous and virus-infected cells. But when obese individuals were randomized to a weight loss program, researchers saw a significant reactivation of natural killer cell function within only 90 days. An exercise component was included in the program, though, so it's difficult to tease out the impact of just the weight loss, since physical activity on its own can boost natural killer cell activity. Which brings us to exercise. Exercise can ramp up our immune system by so much that we can reduce the number of sick days we have to take by 25 to 50%. Natural killer cells taken after 30 minutes of cycling killed off 60% more cancer cells in a petri dish. This may be one of the reasons exercise seems to both prevent cancer and improve cancer survival. Men and women aged 64 and older who were randomized to 25 to 30 minutes of vigorous exercise 3 days a week for 10 months before they got flu shots achieved significantly better protection, though you can't just slouch on the couch all year and jump up for a brisk walk right before your flu or pneumonia shot and expect additional protection. For more on what exercise can do to bolster your immunity, and for which infections interventional studies have shown exercise can help prevent, watch c.nf/exercise immunity. Before we get to sleep, a sidebar: breathing in the forest. Another way to lower cortisol stress hormone levels is by forest bathing, surrounding yourself with trees, which may also elevate natural killer cell activity, as shown in a series of randomized controlled trials I document in c.nf/forest bathing. It turns out, as I explained in my follow-up video, c.nf/tree fragrance, trees produce aromatic volatile compounds called phytoncides, like pinene, that you breathe into your lungs in the forest. They enter your bloodstream and boost natural killer cell activity. A combination of wood aromas improve the recovery of mice from stress-induced immune suppression. But is it really just the fragrance of the forest? Researchers investigated whether the same boost in natural killer cell activity could be achieved by just vaporizing some essential oil from one of the trees into a hotel room overnight, and it worked! Ironically, these phytoncide compounds are part of the tree's own immune system, which we may be able to commandeer. Researchers speculate these compounds may be playing some role in the fact that more heavily forested regions in Japan appear to have lower death rates from breast cancer and prostate cancer. Being out in nature has been found to be an important coping strategy among cancer patients. It turns out that this could potentially help more than just with coping, thanks to the fragrance of trees. Sleep. In mice, sleep deprivation has alternatively been found to undermine vaccine efficacy, have no effect, or even bolster protection. But, consonant with popular wisdom, there is quote-unquote surprisingly strong evidence that sleep enhances immune defense in human beings. Individuals getting inadequate sleep on the days immediately before and after getting a hepatitis B or flu vaccine, for example, fewer than 6 hours compared to more than 7, tended to end up with significantly fewer protective antibodies. This was confirmed in interventional trials of imposed sleep loss. In one study, half the participants had to pull an all-nighter after getting a hepatitis A vaccine. The individuals who had been allowed to sleep normally that night after getting the exact same vaccination ended up with twice the antibodies in their bloodstream a month later. Even 1 year later, they were significantly more protected, all because of one night's sleep. Can't you try to make up for it by sleeping longer on subsequent nights? Even then, the die may have already been cast. Those getting a flu shot during a week in which they were restricted to 4 hours of sleep a night ended up with less than half the antibodies 10 days later compared to the regular sleeping group, despite sleep getting extended to 12 hours a night in the sleep debt group the subsequent week. Sleep deprivation, whether you're going to bed too late or getting up too early, has also been shown to impair natural killer cell activity. What about infection rates? In the Harvard Nurses' Health Study 2, those averaging no more than 5 hours of sleep a night appeared to have about a 40% greater chance of coming down with pneumonia, relative to those sleeping for 8 hours. Those who were both overweight and not sleeping enough were at more than 80% higher risk. In a more direct demonstration, researchers at the Mayo Clinic dripped cold viruses right into people's noses, and those self-reporting sleeping fewer than 7 hours of sleep a night were about 3 times more likely to come down with a cold than those who slept for 8 hours or more. Self-reported sleep tends to underestimate duration, so the study was repeated using a wrist accelerometer for objective measurements. Those sleeping no more than 6 hours a night were 4 times as likely to fall ill compared to those getting 7 hours or more. Note the infection rates were the same, right? After all, they had virus instilled directly into their nose. The well-rested group was just able to clear the virus so quickly that they were 4 times less likely to become symptomatic. Foods. As you can imagine, the upkeep of our immune system takes a tremendous amount of energy. We churn out millions of new immune cells every day. This may be why our immune function contracts as we age, paralleling the shrinkage of other energy-demanding organs such as our muscles. This isn't inevitable, though. Some are able to maintain a fully functional immune system into old age. Part of the deterioration may be a function of the tendency for dietary quality to decline as we get older. Produce aisle protection. Do people who eat well stay well? Those who eat more fruits and vegetables do appear to have lower risk of getting an upper respiratory tract infection like the common cold. Even just one added apple a day may indeed help keep the doctor away. In terms of more serious respiratory infections such as influenza, on a community-wide level, a 5% increase in obesity prevalence is associated with a 6% increase in flu-related hospitalizations. The same increase in physical inactivity rates was linked to a 7% increase in hospitalizations, and low rates of fruit and vegetable consumption may increase flu-related hospitalizations by 8%. Fruit and veggie intake is also linked to all sorts of other healthy behaviors, though the only way to know if shopping in the produce aisle can boost immunity is to put it to the test. To assess the theory that inadequate nutrition could help explain the loss in immune function as you age, researchers split 83 volunteers aged 65 and older into two groups. The experimental group ate at least 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day, while the control group ate fewer than 3. All the participants were then vaccinated against pneumonia, a practice recommended for everyone over the age of 65. The goal of vaccination is to prime our immune system to produce antibodies against that particular pathogen in case we ever get infected. Compared with those in the control group, the study subjects eating 5 or more servings of fruits and vegetables had an 82% greater protective antibody response to the vaccine. This was after just a single month of eating a few extra servings of fruits and veggies a day. That is how much control our forks may exert over our immune function. Kiwi fruit, echinacea, and elderberry. Certain fruits and vegetables may give the immune function an extra boost. One that's been put to the test is kiwi fruit. Preschoolers were randomized to eat either bananas or gold kiwi fruits every day. Compared to the banana group, the kiwi-eating kids appeared to nearly halve their risk of contracting a flu-like illness or cold. Why gold kiwi fruits? The study was funded by the company that owns the patent on gold kiwi fruits. However, about 1 in 130 children may be allergic to kiwi fruit, which makes kiwis the 3rd most common food allergen after milk and eggs, so they're not for everyone. A similar experiment was tried on another high-risk group, the elderly. Those in the control group who ate bananas and got an upper respiratory tract infection suffered with congestion and a sore throat for about 5 days, compared to the kiwi fruit eaters, who felt better after 1 or 2 days. In contrast, anti-flu drugs like oseltamivir or Tamiflu may only shorten symptom duration in adults by an average of about 17 hours. A 2020 review titled Food or Medication: The Therapeutic Effects of Food on the Duration and Incidence of Upper Respiratory Tract Infections noted another advantage. The price of kiwi fruit is, quote, much lower. Kiwis are technically berries. They were known originally as Chinese gooseberries before some innovative New Zealand exporters named the fuzzy brown fruit after their fuzzy brown bird. What about other berries? I'll cover all the studies on elderberries in c.nf/elderberries. In short, 4 studies seem to show positive results, but they were all funded by elderberry product companies. Finally, in 2020, an independent, philanthropy-funded study was published, a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial of an elderberry extract for the treatment of influenza. In contrast to the industry-funded studies, those randomized to the elderberry seemed to do worse, experiencing more aches and pains. Among those not taking Tamiflu, the participants randomized to the elderberry placebo were sick for 5 days, whereas those randomized to the real elderberry were sick for 7 days. The accompanying editorial concluded that, based on these results, quote, we can confidently advise patients not to take elderberry, unquote. As I show in the video, similarly disappointing results have been reported for the herb echinacea. Elderberry supplements may not even be safe. A case report was published about a man taking an elderberry extract suffering an attack of acute pancreatitis, a sudden painful inflammation of the pancreas. What makes the case is that it went away when he stopped taking the supplement and then reappeared again years later when he tried taking it again, which suggests cause and effect. Why take elderberry extracts, though, when you can just eat the elderberries themselves? Because consuming raw elderberries can cause you to puke your guts out, as I found out the hard way after foraging a backyard bush for breakfast. Turns out raw elderberry fruit forms cyanide. Only after recovering did I discover CDC reports like, quote, poisoning from elderberry juice, California, about 8 people having to be medevaced out by helicopter after someone brought freshly squeezed elderberry juice to a gathering. All I can say is I'm glad my body rejected it. What would they have put on the headstone? author of How Not to Die, Killed by a Smoothie. Other berries. What other berries might help us? In c.nf/immune berries, I go through the whole rundown. Interventional studies show, for example, that blueberries can increase the numbers of natural killer cells, the aromatic spice cardamom can increase their activity, and black raspberries appear to do both. But does this translate into fewer infections? See, buckthorn berries boost the activity of another type of first responder immune cell, but fail to help prevent respiratory, digestive, or urinary tract infections compared to placebo. Goji berries do actually appear to have relevant, real-world, beneficial effects on immune function. Older men and women aged 65 to 70 were randomized to eat 4 teaspoons of powdered goji berries or an identical-appearing placebo powder every day for 90 days. On day 30, everyone received a flu shot. By day 60, the goji group already had a significantly better antibody response, such that by day 90, 3 times more of the goji group achieved seroconversion, meaning a sufficiently protective antibody threshold, 28% versus only 9% in the placebo group. A side note, do they need to be organic? In a review updating the evidence of the implications of pesticides on human health, the body of evidence linking pesticide exposure and cancer is said to be, quote, so huge that the role of pesticides in cancer development can no longer be doubted, unquote. However, most of the data showing DNA damage from pesticides are limited to occupational exposure among farmers and workers in the fields within the pesticides industry itself or among those living in high-spray areas. What about the residues left on conventional produce? I explore that body of literature in my video c.nf/pesticides. In short, those who choose organic produce seem to have lower cancer rates after controlling for confounding factors, but even if it is cause and effect, the benefits of consuming conventionally grown produce are likely to outweigh any possible risks from pesticide exposure. So concerns over pesticide risks should never discourage us from eating as many fruits and vegetables as possible. The potential lifelong damage of any pesticides on produce is estimated to cut only a few minutes off a person's life on average, which is nothing compared to the benefits we get from eating fruits and veggies. Vegetables. A series of experiments involving fruit and vegetable deprivation dramatically demonstrate the impact that healthy food can have on our immune function. Figuring that their carotenoid pigments may be responsible for the immune-actuating effects, researchers advised volunteers to try to avoid all brightly colored fruits and vegetables. It didn't take more than 2 weeks for measures of their immune function to plummet. White blood cells taken from the participants became sluggish to proliferate in the face of immune activation. To see how quickly this activation could be recovered, they tried 3 potential rescue treatments each day: 1.5 cups of tomato juice, 1.5 cups of carrot juice, or a serving of powdered spinach. Within a week of starting the tomato juice, white blood cell activity started to significantly perk up, but neither the carrot juice nor the spinach seemed sufficient to salvage immune function. This tells us 2 things. Remarkably, we can affect our immune function with simple dietary decisions, and not all veggies are alike. When this study was repeated to look at other immune markers, tomato and carrot appeared more evenly matched. Spinach was skipped this time. Both the post-deprivation tomato and carrot juice period saw significant increase in natural killer cell activity, for example. In contrast, tomato extract supplements like Lycomado failed to result in any improvements in immune defense. Could something as simple as tomato juice improve immune protection even in those who hadn't been deprived of carotenoid-rich fruits and vegetables? Well-nourished elderly men and women were randomized to a 1.5 cups of tomato juice or mineral water for 8 weeks, and no difference in immune function was found. So if you're stuck in a rut of beige foods like white potatoes, it doesn't take much to recoup some of your lost immune function. But if you're eating a minimum threshold of healthy produce, it's going to take more than a glass of tomato juice. Either add multiple daily servings of fruits and vegetables like in that flu shot study, or level up your veggies to include some of the top of the heap like broccoli. cruciferous vegetables. Later in the book, I'll explore how crucifers are critical for intestinal immune function. Broccoli can also boost our natural killers. Researchers drew blood from study participants before and after they ate broccoli sprouts for just a few days, and found that the ability of their natural killer cells to produce granzyme B went up. That's an enzyme used to activate what are called execution caspases in target cells to initiate a self-destruct protocol and wipe out virus-infected and cancerous cells. Does this translate into helping us actually fight infections? Researchers dripped flu viruses into the noses of volunteers to find out. In a randomized study compared to placebo, alfalfa sprouts, about 4 ounces of broccoli sprouts eaten on the day before and the day of infection significantly reduced the viral load as well as virus-induced inflammation in the nose of smokers. The researchers conclude that cruciferous vegetables like broccoli may present a, quote, low-cost and low-risk measure for reducing the impact of influenza, unquote. The same was found for reducing respiratory syncytial virus disease in mice and blocking Epstein-Barr virus in vitro. Sulforaphane, the purported active ingredient in broccoli and other crucifers, has also been found to restore bacteria recognition and engulfment in macrophages extracted from the lungs of patients with pulmonary diseases like emphysema, COPD. However, the concentration they used might only be reached in the bloodstream by eating around 5 cups of broccoli at one sitting, so we won't know clinical relevance until it's been studied at more modest doses. NO news is good news. Nitric oxide, not to be confused with nitrous oxide, aka laughing gas, is best known as the open sesame molecule our artery lining releases to enable our blood vessels to dilate, but it also has broad-spectrum antiviral, antibacterial, and antifungal properties. It's secreted into our airways as a first line of defense against respiratory infections shooting at more than 500% above baseline. Nitrate-rich vegetables can improve athletic performance, but what about immune performance? Infusions of spinach leaves have been used since ancient times to treat respiratory infections, but as I explore in c.nf/no immune, the evidence that this translates into lower infection rates still remains suggestive. Seaweed. What about underwater greens? Billions of pounds of sea vegetables are harvested each year. Japan has among the highest per capita intake of seaweed, and its consumption is associated with lower disease rates and even lower all-cause mortality, though it may just be an indicator of following more traditional Japanese dietary customs. In terms of immune function, wakame, which is the kind you find in seaweed salad, can double or even quadruple the replication potential of T cells, an important part of our immune defenses against viruses like herpes. See my video c.nf/wakame to learn what eating just 2 grams a day of wakame can do for those suffering from various herpes infections, and how wakame can significantly boost protective antibody responses to flu vaccination. Soy foods can also boost antibody-producing B cells. Those randomized to 3 daily cups of soy milk increased B cell populations in the blood by about 35% more than those receiving dairy milk. Japan also has among the highest per capita soy consumption, so the speculation that seaweed intake may help explain the relatively low rates of HIV and COVID-19 in the country could also be extended to other traditional Japanese foods. What about nori? Probably the most accessible seaweed. They're the sheets used for making sushi rolls, but they can also make quick and easy snacks, one of my go-to favorites. It's hard to beat the nutrient density. Each sheet has as little as a single calorie. The study participants randomized to a nori extract for 8 weeks, experienced an increase in natural killer cell activity. The dose they were given was equivalent to about 7 sheets of nori a day, though, so it's not clear what the effects of smaller doses might be. Chlorella. About 95% of all infections begin in our mucosal surfaces, the moist linings of our eyes, nostrils, and mouth. To protect these surfaces, our body covers them with a special antibody called immunoglobulin A, or IgA. which it pumps out to the tune of 10,000 million billion a day, 1 times 10 to the 19th. This provides an immunological barrier that neutralizes and prevents viruses from penetrating the body. The IgA in saliva, for example, is the first line of defense against pneumonia, influenza, and other respiratory tract infections. Researchers in Japan found that IgA concentrations in breast milk could be increased by giving mothers chlorella, a unicellular freshwater green algae, essentially a single-celled plant, sold as a powder or compressed into tablets. What about other parts of the body? Chlorella didn't convincingly improve the immune response to flu vaccination, but it did increase IgA secretion into the mouth. Unfortunately, as I cover in c.nf/IgA chlorella, it's not clear if this translates into fewer illnesses. Chlorella can also significantly improve natural killer cell activity. This may play a role in reducing liver damage and chronic hepatitis C virus infection, with benefits for cholesterol, blood pressure, and blood sugar control. But as I note in my video, c.nf/NK chlorella, there was a concerning case report of apparent chlorella-induced psychosis that makes me wary. Garlic. In World War II, garlic was called Russian penicillin because, after running out of antibiotics, that's what the Soviet government turned to. Does it actually work? Eating garlic appears to offer the best of both worlds, dampening the overreactive phase of the immune system by suppressing inflammation while boosting protective immunity, such as natural killer cell activity. Check out c.nf/colds and cancer for double-blind, placebo-controlled trials of garlic for the prevention of the common cold and cancer. Garlic supplement users did not appear to be protected from COVID, but it may take up to 54 capsules of garlic extract supplements to obtain the same amount of garlicky goodness found in just 1 clove of crushed raw garlic. What happens if you cook it? If you compare raw chopped garlic to garlic that's been cooked in various methods, you can see dramatic drops in one of the purported active ingredients. You get a 66% drop when you boil it for 6 minutes, 94% less when you simmer it for about 15 minutes, and a full 100% wiped out after just 1 minute of stir-frying it. What about roasted garlic? Surprisingly, even though roasting is done at temperatures hotter than boiling water, it preserves about twice as much. Raw garlic has the most, but it may be easier for some to eat 2 or 3 cloves of cooked garlic than the equivalent, half of a clove, of raw. In How Not to Die, I suggested that the only major caveat against consuming garlic, besides a potential decrease in kissability, is that garlic can have blood-thinning effects, so maybe you shouldn't have any a week before elective surgery. That was based on a study in which subjects were fed 10 grams of garlic every day for 2 months, which is about 3 daily cloves. However, at a more quote-unquote socially acceptable dose of 1 to 2 cloves a day for a week, no changes in clotting function were noted. What about garlic breath? Raw apple, raw lettuce, and mint leaves have all been shown to be at least partially effective. Mushrooms. As I show in my video c.nf/mushrooms, cooked white button mushrooms can also boost IgA production while potentially tamping down on immune overreactivity. A randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical study confirmed an apparent anti-allergy effect of an oyster mushroom component in kids who had a history of recurrent upper respiratory tract infections. Shiitake mushrooms have also been shown to improve human immune function. Just eating 2 or 3 large dried shiitake mushrooms a day for a month resulted in an increase in the proliferation of 2 types of first-line immune defenders, all while lowering markers of systemic inflammation. What we care about most, though, is actually preventing infections. White button mushroom supplementation enhances natural killer cell activity in aged mice, for example, but it doesn't actually protect them against subsequent influenza infection. Oyster mushrooms seem to work, at least in athletes. After intensive exercise, elite athletes can suffer a 28% reduction in natural killer cell activity during recovery. When they were given about 1 daily oyster mushroom's worth of the special beta-glucan fiber found in fungi, sourced from oyster mushrooms, not only did their natural killer cell counts buoy up, but they suffered fewer upper respiratory tract symptoms over 3 months. In the placebo group, 84% suffered 4 or more symptoms compared to only 12% in the mushroom group. Nutritional yeast. The same immune-activating beta-glucan fibers found in brewers, bakers, and nutritional yeasts. Details in c.nf/nooch, spelled N-O-O-C-H, but basically the IgA-boosting effects of the beta-glucan from a daily heaping teaspoon or so of nutritional yeast can reduce the incidence, duration, and severity of upper respiratory tract infections compared to placebo. And what's the downside? Tastier popcorn? Randomized controlled trials have also found it has anti-inflammatory effects sufficient to improve wound healing, reduce the severity of canker sores, and alleviate symptoms in ragweed sufferers, as well as benefit weight loss. None of the studies reported treatment-related adverse effects, but I would caution against the use of any kind of yeast for those with 2 specific autoimmune diseases, Crohn's disease, and you can check out c.nf/Crohn's, spelled C-R-O-H-N-S, as well as a skin condition known as hidradenitis suppurativa at c.nf/hidradenitis, which is Hidradenitis. Green tea. Our body is always on the lookout for PAMPs, pathogen-associated molecular patterns. These are molecules foreign to our body that are associated with infections, such as components of bacterial cell walls. We have immune cells with pattern recognition receptors that recognize these so-called non-self signatures. Not all bacteria are pathogenic, though, so in order to be more accurate, the name was changed to MAMPs, microbe-associated molecular patterns. The beta-glucans in yeast and mushrooms are major MAMPs. They make up the cell walls of fungi, so they act as non-specific immunostimulants, as opposed to specific immunostimulants like a vaccine. Essentially, when our body detects beta-glucans in our system, to err on the side of caution, it immediately thinks fungal infection, not shiitake stir-fry. We can then benefit from that increased vigilance. There are also MAMP mimickers in certain plants. Bacteria, fungi, parasites, and tumor cells all release a class of MAMP compounds called alkylamines. Theanine, the unique amino acid that gives tea its savory or umami taste, is broken down in our gut into an alkylamine called ethylamine, which then circulates throughout our body. You can tell if someone's a tea drinker by testing their urine for ethylamine. There are also pre-existing alkylamines in apple peels and butylamine, wine, isoamylamine, and healthy vaginal secretions, isobutylamine. Alkylamines enhance the proliferation and activity of gamma-delta T cells, a type of first-line defender. The priming of these cells by ethylamine may explain why gamma-delta T cells taken from tea drinkers are more active than those taken from coffee drinkers. Take white blood cells before and after just a week of tea drinking, and you get 2 to 4 times the defensive interferon release upon exposure to bacteria in vitro. The day-to-day low-level exposure to ethylamine seemed to maintain their immune cells in a constant ready state. There's even been speculation that primate immune systems evolved to take immune-boosting advantage of the alkylamines in their precursors in plant foods. Tea drinkers have been documented to have lower rates of influenza and as little as half the risk of dying from pneumonia. A randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial found that those taking concentrated green tea capsules had about 1/3 fewer days of cold and flu symptoms compared to those randomized to placebo capsules, but the dose equivalent was comparable to drinking 10 cups of tea a day. Subsequently, a similar trial on healthcare workers found that those participants randomized to the equivalent of just 1 1/4 cups of green tea a day for 5 months were about 3 times less likely to come down with the flu, 4% versus 13% in the placebo group. How low can you go? In 2020, researchers tried to push the envelope and found that even the equivalent of a half cup of green tea a day, about a typical teacup's worth, cut the risk of upper respiratory infection in half, but less than a 1/4 cup a day did not. A sidebar, what about gargling with green tea? A study that involved swabbing the mouths of volunteers 10, 40, and 60 minutes after they drank some tea found that antiviral concentrations of tea compounds were retained in the oral cavity even an hour after ingestion. The studies that I mentioned earlier found a reduction in infection risk even with swallowed green tea extract capsules. They show that direct contact with our throat is not necessary. What about the opposite? What about gargling green tea and spitting it out so there's only oral contact? As I note in c.nf/gargling, acrobatic attempts have been made to present purported tea gargling benefits as statistically significant for upper respiratory tract infections or influenza, either by folding them in with tea ingestion trials or combining them with observational gargling studies. However, that doesn't change the fact that none of the randomized controlled trials of tea gargling have been found to significantly lower infection risk. The evidence for water gargling to prevent upper respiratory tract infections is also disappointing. So, although gargling may work wonders to soothe a sore throat, it may not prevent the sore throat in the first place, unless it's caused by gonorrhea. A single 1-minute gargle with an antiseptic mouthwash, Listerine diluted up to 1 to 4 with water in this case, can significantly reduce the amount of any gonorrhea bacteria you have in your oral cavity. Gargling has been found to be superior to simply rinsing out your mouth in terms of reaching the back of your throat. At least 20 seconds is recommended, but in a study of female sex workers, the average gargle time was only 4 seconds. Fiber-rich foods. In my high in fiber-rich foods chapter in How Not to Diet, I relayed the detective story of the search for the keys that fit into 2 mysterious locks in the body, vital receptors expressed heavily throughout our body on our nerves, in our gut, and in our immune, muscle, and fat cells. Spoiler alert, they were the short-chain fatty acids our gut bacteria make when we eat fiber, constituting a critical line of communication between our gut bacteria and the rest of our body. This may explain how fiber is so anti-inflammatory. For instance, how is it possible that just one high-fiber meal can improve lung function in asthmatics within a matter of hours? We now know that our good gut bacteria turn the fiber we eat into short-chain fatty acids, which then are absorbed into our bloodstreams. They're then free to dock into these receptors found on the inflammatory immune cells in our airways and turn them off. Does it mean that people who eat more fiber tend to have better immune systems? How might we determine that? Well, most people have gotten an MMR shot, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccinations that's been routinely given to children since the 1970s. Are there measurably more antibodies against pathogens in different dietary groups? Yes, for mumps. All participants had received the same MMR vaccine, but those eating more fiber had significantly higher levels of antibodies against mumps, though not against any of the other bugs. To help prove cause and effect, researchers gave volunteers a cocktail of antibiotics to wipe out much of their gut flora as they were getting their annual flu vaccine. Those starting out with low pre-existing immunity suffered a striking impairment of their antibody response. They had much weaker reactions to the vaccine. Conversely, by randomizing people to prebiotics like fiber, which is what our good bacteria eat, or probiotics, the good bacteria themselves, antibody responses to flu shots can be enhanced. Does this translate into lower infection risk? Those with higher levels of fiber-feeding bacteria in their gut were found to be 5 times less likely to develop viral pneumonia or bronchitis. Establishing cause and effect, a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials found that prebiotics can reduce the incidence of respiratory tract infections in general. For probiotics, in children, those randomized to probiotic dairy yogurt, soy yogurt, or supplements experience both fewer and shorter-lasting upper respiratory tract infections, though in older adults, only the duration of symptoms appears to be lessened. Given the potentially negative impacts of probiotics I note in the prebiotics and postbiotics chapter later on, I would suggest instead focusing on feeding the good bacteria we already have by eating foods naturally rich in dietary fiber. Do vegetarians make better killers? As we get older, our natural killer cells tend to lose some of their proliferative capacity and killing power. What can we do to maintain their function? I reviewed a few plants that appear protective, but what about an entire diet centered around plants? The natural killer cells of vegetarians were pitted head-to-head against those of omnivores in a test to see which could wipe out more leukemia cells, and the vegetarian killer cells were victorious. They're more than twice as effective in killing off cancer. On average, each natural killer cell drawn from the blood of a vegetarian knocked off 2 cancer cells for every one the non-vegetarian killers succeeded in overtaking. The researchers suggested that, quote, the reduced cancer risk of vegetarians is possibly partially related to the better natural defense system which they seem to have, unquote. Having more effective immunity doesn't just help protect against cancer by targeting tumors directly. Sometimes infections cause cancers. Take HPV, human papillomavirus. Cervical cancer is now considered a sexually transmitted disease. It was originally suspected as such based on cancer rates in nuns versus prostitutes, but we now have DNA fingerprinting proof that virtually all cervical cancer is caused by HPV, a sexually transmitted virus that also causes cancer of the penis, vagina, vulva, and throat. HPV is considered a necessary but insufficient cause of cancer. HPV is so common that most young women will contract it, yet most don't get cervical cancer because their immune systems are able to wipe out the virus. Within 1 year, 70% of women clear the infection, and more than 90% clear it within 2 years before the virus can cause cancer. Might those with particularly strong immune systems clear the virus even faster? That may explain the finding that vegetarian women had significantly lower HPV infection rates, when many studies reporting lower risk of HPV infection among those eating plant-based diets. Greater vegetable consumption alone may even help. Researchers followed women with cancer-causing strains of HPV infecting their cervix and retested them at 3 months and 9 months while analyzing their diets. Higher levels of vegetable consumption appeared to cut their risk of HPV persistence in half, doubling their likelihood of clearing this potentially cancer-causing infection. This may help explain why vegan women have significantly lower rates of all female cancers combined, including cancer of the cervix. However, comparison of the natural killer cell activity between vegans and non-vegetarians failed to replicate the earlier study, so other cancer-fighting components or non-immunological mechanisms may be responsible for the lower cancer rates. Sidebar: plant-based pandemic protection. The COVID-19 pandemic offered a good opportunity to see if eating more healthfully could help stave off infection. Details in c.nf/plantdemic. But basically, Harvard researchers collected data from nearly 600,000 participants and found that those who ate the most healthful plant foods and the least meat, eggs, dairy, and junk not only had significantly lower risk of suffering a severe course of COVID-19, but they also had a significantly lower risk of getting infected in the first place, even after taking into account comorbidities and other non-dietary lifestyle risk factors such as exercise, smoking, and socioeconomic status. Supplements. Are there any supplements that can help protect against infection? Ginseng. Ginseng is notable for its Latin name Panax, which comes from the word panacea, meaning cure-all. It can extend the lives of fruit flies and roundworms, but not mice. The two main species are American ginseng, Panax quinquefolius, and Asian ginseng, Panax ginseng, which can be further divided up by processing method. White ginseng is Asian ginseng root that's simply washed and dried. Red ginseng is Asian ginseng root that undergoes an additional step of steaming before drying. Various ginseng preparations have been shown to boost populations of B cells and T cells and natural killer cell activity, but what about disease endpoints? A meta-analysis of randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trials found that ginseng appeared to reduce the risk of developing acute upper respiratory infections, but it did not appear to significantly affect the duration of illness. A subgroup analysis, however, suggests that the preventive benefit is limited to Asian ginseng, which cuts infection risk in half compared to placebo, as opposed to American ginseng, which reduced risk by only 14%, not reaching statistical significance. I'll cover the downsides in c.nf/ginseng abuse. Aside from the symptoms of ginseng abuse syndrome and tissue swelling, there have been case reports of manic psychosis, estrogenic effects, and increased surgical bleeding. So, some recommend that those with hypertension, hyperthyroidism, a predisposition to mania, estrogen-dependent disease, or upcoming surgery avoid ginseng. Multivitamins. All nutrients play some role in the functioning of the immune system. If you have a nutrient deficiency, then supplementation could certainly improve immunity, but we shouldn't expect that adding extra on top of nutrient sufficiency would necessarily further amplify immune function. However, many apparently healthy elderly people have been found to have micronutrient deficits, So what about taking a multivitamin and mineral supplement? Extraordinary benefits were published in some of the most prestigious journals, leading reviewers to conclude, quote, all these reports confirm that immune responses may be enhanced in elderly individuals by the use of micronutrient supplements, unquote. Then most of the papers were retracted, one after another. An earlier paper published by one of the principal authors tipped off investigators, quote-unquote, impossible results from a study purporting to show cognitive benefits of multivitamin and mineral supplements led to a formal investigation that confirmed the impropriety, which led to a cascade of retractions. Since the debacle, there have been 3 large randomized controlled trials of multivitamin and mineral supplements for the prevention of infections. One such study, on non-institutionalized elders and acute respiratory infections, found no effect on incidence or severity. Another, on nursing home residents and infections in general, found no fewer cases of infections, though those randomized to the multivitamin and mineral supplements did end up spending fewer days on antibiotics over the 18-month-long study. The third study looked at multivitamin and multimineral supplements separately and found the antibody response to flu vaccines improved on the minerals compared to placebo, while the antibody response to flu vaccines on the vitamins were worse than placebo. Neither, however, led to a significant drop in infection rates. Vitamin C. Vitamin C has been proposed as a treatment for respiratory infections since its discovery nearly a century ago. In 1970, Nobel Prize laureate Linus Pauling published an influential book titled Vitamin C and the Common Cold that generated tremendous public interest and no doubt helped inspire the dozens of randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials that were to follow to put his endorsement to the test. Check out c.nf/C4colds, which is C, the numeral 4, colds, for details on what they found, but basically those under extreme physical stress, such as marathon runners or soldiers on subarctic maneuvers, do appear to benefit from taking regular vitamin C supplements, cutting the risk of coming down with a cold in half. However, for the general population, daily vitamin C supplementation does not appear to significantly reduce the incidence of infection, though when regular users do get sick, they don't tend to get as sick and get better about 10% faster. Unfortunately, just starting vitamin C after the onset of cold symptoms doesn't seem to help cut down on cold severity or duration. The downside is that vitamin C supplements appear to favor kidney stone formation as much as doubling risk. Those taking 1,000 milligrams or so of vitamin C a day may have a 1 in 300 chance of getting a kidney stone every year instead of a 1 in 600 chance, which is not an insignificant risk given how painful they can be. Vitamins D and E. Daily vitamin D supplementation appears to reduce the risk of acute respiratory infections in children and adolescents, but it does not seem to make a difference in adults, nor is D effective for boosting antibody responses to influenza vaccination. Vitamin E, on the other hand, was able to significantly boost immunity to hepatitis B and tetanus vaccinations, though not to diphtheria or pneumonia. As I detail in c.nf/immune vitamins, the data on vitamin E and infections are mixed, with some studies showing a worsening of infections. The question appears moot since randomized controlled trials show vitamin E increases the risk of cancer and overall mortality. In other words, those who buy vitamin E supplements may in effect be paying to live a shorter life. Zinc. In February 2020, a noted virologist told his friends and family, stock up now with zinc lozenges for the coming pandemic. He based his supposition on the efficacy of zinc for common colds, up to 29% of which are caused by coronaviruses. There's actually a heartwarming backstory to that discovery that I detail in c.nf/zinc, involving a 3-year-old girl with cancer who inspired her father to conduct the first randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial on zinc lozenges for the common cold. I run through all the studies in the video, but basically zinc lozenges appear to shorten colds by about 3 days, with significant reductions in nasal discharge by 34%, nasal congestion by 37%, hoarseness by 43%, and cough by 46%. The best way to take zinc for the common cold is lozenges containing around 10 to 15 milligrams of zinc, taken every 2 waking hours for a few days, starting immediately upon symptom onset as either zinc acetate or zinc gluconate, without binders such as citric acid, tartaric acid, glycine, sorbitol, or mannitol. efficacy against more serious infections such as pneumonia may only be present among those with pre-existing zinc deficiency. I was surprised to learn that the essentiality of zinc in humans wasn't established until the 1960s and wasn't formally recognized until 1974. About 40% of men and women in the United States aged 60 and older may not reach the recommended daily intake through their diet. Unlike some other minerals, such as iron, you can't just get a blood test to see if you're deficient because zinc levels in the blood aren't a good reflection of overall zinc status in the body. The best we can do is make sure we get enough in our diet. The healthiest sources are probably legumes, nuts, and seeds, though oysters may be the most concentrated source by far. A single oyster has more zinc than a cup of baked beans. Zinc supplementation doesn't appear to reduce the risk of getting sick in the first place, though, and supplementing long-term may actually impair certain aspects of immunity in the elderly. This is perhaps because at high doses, zinc can interfere with the absorption of other nutrients important to immune function, such as copper and folate. A month of zinc supplementation did appear to boost the antibody response to tetanus vaccination, but even 2 months of zinc supplementation before flu shots didn't appear to have any effect. Short-term use is considered to be safe, but zinc supplements and lozenges can cause nausea, especially when taken on an empty stomach and other gastrointestinal symptoms. You should never put zinc in your nose. In the drugstore, you'll find all sorts of intranasal zinc gels, sprays, and swabs, but these have been linked to the potentially permanent loss of one's sense of smell. Note there was a happy ending. The 3-year-old beat her cancer, never relapsed, and grew up to become a scientist herself. Vaccines. Vaccines are considered one of the greatest public health achievements of the last century, having eradicated smallpox, a scourge that killed hundreds of millions of people, and greatly reducing other major diseases such as measles and polio. To this day, vaccines are estimated to save millions of lives each year. Whether 90% of U.S. children get common childhood vaccinations such as polio and MMR shots, but most adults fail to get their full complement of recommended adult vaccinations. Assuming you got all your childhood vaccinations, and aside from any emergent pandemic needs, the CDC recommends that all adults get annual flu shots, tetanus boosters every 10 years, though the World Health Organization does not think that is necessary, shingles vaccination at age 50, and pneumonia vaccination at age 65. Certain groups need more than others, such as hepatitis A vaccination for those experiencing homelessness, people with chronic liver disease, or men who have sex with men, or a hepatitis B series for healthcare workers and those who are incarcerated. Ask your medical professional for a personalized schedule. How safe are vaccines? In a 2021 systematic review and meta-analysis, the RAND Corporation screened more than 50,000 citations and concluded that routine vaccinations can be considered safe, with only rare, serious adverse effects, such as severe allergic reactions in 1 to 10 individuals in a million, transient autoimmune syndromes like Guillain-Barré and immune thrombocytopenic purpura occur in about 1 to 3 in a million, and 10 to 30 in a million for flu shots and MMR vaccines, respectively. Flu vaccine. Each year, influenza typically kills between 4,000 and 20,000 Americans, though the death toll for the 2017-18 flu season was estimated at 80,000, making it one of the deadliest in the last half-century. Most hospitalizations and 90% of flu-related mortality occur in those 65 and older. Mortality rates for the flu at ages 75 and older are 50 times higher than those younger than 65. Nonetheless, the CDC recommends that everyone over the age of 6 months gets routine flu shots every year, if for no other reason than to help prevent transmission to the more vulnerable. As I've discussed, the cruel irony is that older adults, the ones who need protection the most, acquire less robust protection from flu shots due to waning immunity with age. Depending on the season, vaccination typically reduces the risk of getting the flu by about 40 to 50%. So in healthy younger adults, we can say with moderate certainty that we can decrease the risk of getting the flu from about 2% each year down to just under 1%. Among older adults, there may be a similar relative risk reduction from 6% down to 2.4%, but since the risk is higher and the consequence is greater, the absolute benefits are greater too. In the Northern Hemisphere, the flu season can start as early as September and run as late as March. The problem with getting vaccinated too early is that immunity might wane before the season is over, especially in older adults. the CDC recommends trying to get vaccinated by the end of October, but getting it at any time during the flu season is preferable to not getting vaccinated at all. Yes, the influenza vaccine can cause Guillain-Barré syndrome, an autoimmune attack on your nerves that can leave you paralyzed for weeks, but so too can getting the flu. As I mentioned, there are only 1 to 3 additional individual cases of Guillain-Barré per 1 million vaccinations, versus about 17 extra cases per million flu episodes. So you're much more likely to be temporarily paralyzed by the flu than the flu shot, but since it takes vaccinating about 30 older people to prevent 1 case of the flu, getting vaccinated would still be expected to raise your overall Guillain-Barré risk. However, the reason flu shots are recommended is not to lower risk of a rare autoimmune syndrome, but to reduce the common and potentially devastating impacts of the flu that extend beyond just the respiratory infection. In the week following a confirmed flu infection, the risk of having a heart attack shoots up 6 times higher. The inflammation of infection can destabilize atherosclerotic plaques, constrict arteries, and make the blood more liable to clot. So might flu vaccinations save lives in more ways than one? Those who get their flu shots are indeed less likely to die from cardiovascular disease in a given year, as well as all causes put together. In other words, those who get regular flu shots live longer lives on average. But who disproportionately gets flu shots? White, married, non-smokers of a higher socioeconomic class with higher levels of education, higher incomes, and health insurance. You can't tell if it's truly cause and effect until you put it to the test. There have been 4 randomized controlled trials, flu shots versus placebo shots, in those with pre-existing heart disease, and overall, those who got the real shots had a 56% lower risk of dying from cardiovascular disease and a 47% lower risk of dying from all causes put together. So flu shots really can be an extraordinary lifesaver. Whether the observational data showing fewer deaths across the board, even including those without pre-existing heart disease, similarly pan out is, as of yet, unknown. Given the benefits, overcoming vaccine hesitancy should be as simple as correcting misinformation, but sadly, debunking vaccine myths can actually backfire. Busting the myth that inactivated flu shots, the type given to older adults, can give you the flu surprisingly makes people even less likely to get it. Similarly, correcting the falsehoods that MMR vaccines cause autism, or that pertussis vaccination causes as many side effects as people think, paradoxically makes people less inclined to vaccinate. The researchers conclude that, quote, correcting vaccine myths may not be an effective approach to promoting vaccination, unquote. Pneumonia vaccine. Pneumonia may well be called the friend of the aged, wrote Sir William Osler, the father of modern medicine, in 1898. Taken off by it in an acute, short, not often painful illness, the old man escapes those cold gradations of decay so distressing to himself and to his friends. The thought was that pneumonia mercifully killed those who would soon die anyway from a potentially more protracted and painful illness. But these days, healthy older adults hospitalized with pneumonia are not significantly more likely to die in the subsequent 2 years than younger adults in the same situation. Because of comorbidities at older ages, though, pneumonia is the 4th leading cause of death in the world and 9th leading cause of death in the United States. The most common cause of community-acquired pneumonia, as opposed to hospital-acquired, is a bacteria known as pneumococcus, also known as Streptococcus pneumoniae. In addition to pneumonia, pneumococcus can cause inner ear infections, sinusitis, and pink eye. It gets serious when it starts to invade the bloodstream, which can result in meningitis, infection of the brain, endocarditis, infection of the heart valves, or sepsis, a life-threatening organ dysfunction caused by blood poisoning. Thankfully, we have vaccines against pneumococcus. The first was developed more than a century ago, but it fell out of favor as penicillin was discovered. It was thought that antibiotics would eliminate the threat. Unfortunately, these days, up to 40% of pneumococcal infections are resistant to at least one antibiotic, and despite our miracle drugs, mortality rates of invasive pneumococcus in the elderly stand at around 15 to 30%. According to randomized controlled trials, pneumococcus vaccinations can reduce the risk of those 65 and older getting pneumococcal pneumonia by 64%, and even more important, the risk of invasive pneumococcal disease by 73%. Like the flu vaccine, population studies have found that pneumonia vaccines appear to reduce both the risk of heart attacks and overall risk of dying, But unlike the flu vaccine, there aren't randomized controlled trials to confirm these bonus benefits. Shingles vaccine. A major issue hampering the uptake of shingles vaccination is the lack of awareness of the disease. Shingles is caused by a reactivation of the chickenpox virus later in life. After your body beats back chickenpox, the virus hides in your spinal cord, waiting for an opportunity to strike again. When your defenses are down, the virus can surge forth, traveling along the path of a nerve branching off the spinal cord and wrapping around one side of the body to the front, producing skin blisters in a characteristic belt-like pattern that does not cross the midline. Both shingles and the name of the virus, zoster, are from the Latin and Greek respectively for belt. The blistering rash can be intensely painful and leave behind scarring or discoloration, but usually disappears on its own in a few weeks. However, approximately 30 to 50% of those with shingles suffer what's called post-herpetic neuralgia, persistent pain that can last for a year or more and sometimes be debilitating. It usually affects nerves around the trunk, but in 10 to 25% of cases it can erupt across your face and lead to permanent facial muscle weakness, hearing loss, or blindness. As if all that isn't bad enough, having shingles as much as quintuples your odds of having a stroke over the subsequent few weeks, a risk that gradually declines over the following 6 to 12 months. It's surprising that more people don't know about this, since the lifetime risk of getting shingles is 30%, meaning nearly 1 in 3 of us will get it sometime in our lives. Young adults only have about a 1 in 1,000 chance of getting it every year, whereas it climbs to closer to 1 in 100 per year for older adults. That comes out to 1 million cases of shingles annually in the United States. Thankfully, there is a shingles vaccine. The first, called Zostavax, became available in 2006 using a live weakened strain of the virus. The efficacy was only about 50%, though, and it couldn't be administered to immunocompromised individuals, such as those with HIV or on immunosuppressive drugs, such as chemotherapy. In 2017, however, a recombinant shingles vaccine was approved, called Shingrix, with a 90 to 97% efficacy for preventing an outbreak. It requires 2 separate injections 2 to 6 months apart and is expensive, about $280, but it's covered by Medicare Part D and most private insurance plans. It can also cause transient systemic symptoms such as muscle aches, fatigue, headache, fever, and chills about 10% of the time. But Shingrix is considered to be so much more effective that it's recommended for everyone starting at age 50, even if you were previously immunized with Zostavax. Given that the new vaccine is only about 5 years old, we don't yet have longer-term safety and efficacy data. They're still coming in, but so far so good. I recently turned 50 and lined right up for mine.